So the infamous act that Robert is known for, so his reputation, whether people sympathize with him or view him as a madman, occurs in this moment when he mutinies against Captain Leather, goes against his captain's orders, and decides, with the help of Devlin, to let the horses through the gates so they have a chance to avoid all the uh, bombshells that are dropping on the signals office and all around the barn. So Robert thinks if he can free these horses, at least let them out, they'll have a chance of surviving this bombing attack. At first he wanted to retreat with them. At this point he just wants to let them out so they have a greater chance of surviving. And then Devlin, you'll remember Devlin is the character who collected the stained glass, and he has that association with fragility, but he was a sympathetic person. And he and Robert decide to go against Captain Leather's orders and let the horses through the gates. So this could be viewed as an act of treason, which is how Captain Leather views it. He sees them as being traitors, and he tries to call the military police. But he ends up shooting Devlin. But both Robert and Devlin agree that it's Captain Leather who is the madman, who is now insane or irrational, and it's the sane thing to do would be to let the horses free so they could have this chance of surviving. So all chaos is breaking loose, and in this moment, sort of whether they're right or wrong becomes also kind of a gray area, right? We don't know for certain to say who was the sane person, who was the insane person, who was thinking rationally and who wasn't. I think we sympathize more with Robert in his stand to protect the animals because he's acting out of a sort of selfless, compassionate, empathetic position, wanting to save the living creatures, the horses, and that's what he sees his role as a soldier, right, is to protect all living creatures. And here Captain Leather is sort of the antagonist, and he's all about following orders and maintaining the rank. So if his underlings or whatever, Robert and Devlin, go against him, he sees this as treasonous, and they're traitors in his eyes. And then on 183 we have this conversation between Devlin and Robert as they decide to break ranks and save the animals. Robert says, "Leather's insane," said Robert flatly. "It cannot be called disobedience to save these animals when they'll be needed, for God's sake, half an hour after this is over. And if we stay here, how can they avoid being killed?" Devlin concurred. They both stood up and began to release the horses and mules and to drive them into the yards. Robert sent Devlin running so that he could open the gate and let the animals escape. And then it's at this moment that Captain Leather sees what they're doing, tries to call the military police, but no one came, so he goes and he's running out in the yard with his gun, and then he ends up, he sees Devlin as a traitor and shoots him. And then Robert saw all this happen, comes out, and Leather is pointing the gun at Robert as well, views him as a traitor. And again, all chaos is breaking loose. There's bombs going off all around them. Everything was on fire. The barn is on fire. The signals office, where they just were, is completely in ruins. So it's Captain Leather versus Robert, and then bombs go off again. Robert is blown off into the road. He comes back, and all the horses and mules that were in the yard are either wounded or dead. So he gets out his gun to shoot the animals. This is on 184. He got out the Webley, meaning to shoot the animals not yet dead, but he paused for the barest moment, looking at the whole scene laid out before him. And his anger rose to such a pitch that he feared he was going to go over into madness. He stood where the gate had been, and he thought, if an animal had done this, we would call it mad and shoot it. And at that precise moment, Captain Leather rose to his knees and began to struggle to his feet. Robert shot him between the eyes. It took him half an hour to kill the mules and horses. Then he tore the lapels from his uniform and left the battlefield. So at this point, Robert has met his breaking point. He doesn't know if he's thinking rationally anymore, if this is his anger meets a sort of fever pitch, and he shoots Leather sort of point blank, right between the eyes. And he recalls shooting a horse gone mad, right? So the line between man and animal is definitely blurred in this instance. Where Robert sees Leather as kind of a madman, just the same as he would put down a horse that's gone mad or untamable. He does the same, puts Leather out of his misery and shoots him, and then he deserts his post. So he tears the lapels off his uniform, so he's no longer a soldier at this point. He's abandoned his post and left the battlefield. So he's now officially a deserter, and the military police will be after him, right? Because he has deserted his post, and this is believed to be traitorish, or like a traitor or treason. So he's a wanted man. So on page 188 and 189, we have the repetition of that earlier scene. You'll recall the prologue, page 5, is it starts with she was standing in the middle of the railroad tracks, and we have the exact same passage repeated. So this is the repeated moment, which we didn't really know about before, but this is now explained, the significance of this scene where Robert is walking alone and then sees the horse and dog together, and they see the horses that are in the train cars that's been just sort of abandoned there. So he lets all the horses out of the train cars and then says, then we shall all go together. So this is Robert leading this stampede of horses. This is part of the sort of infamous story. It's almost kind of a mythic story. So on page 189, half an hour later, the 12 cars stood quite empty, and Robert was riding along the tracks behind 130 horses with the dog trotting beside him. They were on the road to Magdalen Wood by 1 a.m. This was when the moon rose red. So Robert now is leaving his post accompanied by 130 horses and a dog. So it's a very sort of symbolic moment where he and the animals are all aligned. And he says, we shall all go together. So that pronoun we is very important in this last section. He doesn't make a distinction between himself and the animals. They are all sort of one together, a joined group, unified group. And then we get all of the sort of competing stories or histories that have been surfacing since this event, and this is where the sort of history is kind of muddled. We don't know quite what is fact, what is fiction, what's rumor or gossip, or what is actually what happened. So there are sort of competing stories, and this is where Robert, we don't know how to interpret him. Is he a madman? Is he insane? Or is he the one we should sympathize with? Is he our hero? So he sort of exists within this ambiguous place in history, where some people sympathize with what he did and view him as a heroic person for doing what he did, and then others view him as a traitor and as a madman. So he kind of he forces us to sort of make choice in how we want to interpret his character. So there's some sort of ambiguity there in how we can interpret and understand what he did. So this is on page 189, and this is our narrator speaking. Here is where the mythology is muddled. There are stories of immediate pursuit, but these are doubtful. Some versions have it that Robert rode through the La Chandrelle at a gallop, all of the horses running in front of him, stampeded. There are several witnesses to this. They describe Robert as some sort of raving cowboy, giving the rebel yell as he flew past, driving the horses deliberately through a cordon of soldiers, hastily thrown up to prevent his escaping, killing 3, 5, 9, and even a dozen pickets. None of this is in the transcript of his court-martial, but the witnesses insist it was the case. Far more likely is the version that describes the horses making a detour around the woods lying west of La Chandrelle, and waking in their passage the troops who were under the command of one Major Mickle, whose bivouac was in the field of flax on the other side of the wood. Here it is said Robert shot Private Castles, and this is more probable. Private Castles was certainly killed by someone, and there are 2 witnesses, one of whom testified at the court-martial proceedings, both of whom claim that Castles went out unarmed to prevent Robert's passing, and that when the private made a grab for Robert's reins, Robert shot him in the face. What has never been made clear is why Private Castles felt compelled to challenge Robert in the first place. After all, Robert was an officer of the field artillery and had every right to be in charge of a convoy of horses. The obvious answer to this is that Castles was alert enough to perceive how unlikely it might be that horses should be driven away from the center of Beaulieu, and no one has said for certain this was the case. So there is sort of some controversy in regards to whether or not Robert is a hero or a madman. He appears to have shot this young private right in the face. So, we can't view that in a heroic way. So there's some gray area, moral gray area, whether Robert was right or wrong in doing what he did. We can sympathize and understand why he did it. He was taking the horses away from the battle lines. He, at this point, wanted them to be free, and he has, we know he's experienced severe trauma up to this moment, and so this is sort of the result of everything that's occurred, all the death and loss, and his traumatic physical assault as well has all taken its toll on his psychological state. So this is a very symbolic moment where he is fleeing his post along with this large convoy of horses all together. And then they end up, Robert and 50 of the horses, the other ones were put into large barns. And then Robert, the dog, and the horses were in the barns, and then they were surrounded by Mickle, Major Mickle, who had followed Robert and was sort of going to arrest him because obviously he is viewed as a traitor, and he's at this point is sort of commandeering all these horses and retreating with them. So Mickle was determined that he should regain the horses, and then Robert is trying to protect the horses. So he wants them to go free. He intends for them to all be released. And then we have this showdown at the barn where Mickle is trying to get Robert to surrender himself and the horses. Robert refuses, and then Mickle assumes that Robert is not in the barn alone. So on page 191 they have an exchange where Robert makes it clear that he doesn't intend to back down in this matter.